everyone. My name is Allison Colden, and I'm the Maryland Fisheries Scientist for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. I'm out here this afternoon on Black Walnut Creek. You can see this beautiful creek right next to our office here in Annapolis, Maryland. And I'm out here today, and you may see this pole behind me, on one of our restoration oyster reefs. Whoop. We built this reef here in Black Walnut Creek to help restore oysters in this area and all of the benefits that they provide. So while you all are stuck at home in this era of physical distancing, we can still connect with nature. So that's what we're doing here today. And today I want to get up close and personal with the eastern oyster. You can see here I have some oysters that we grew here at the Philip Merrill Center, and I wanted to spend some time today telling you 5 things that you may not know about the eastern oyster. So first of all, the eastern oyster is the species of oyster we have here in the Chesapeake Bay, but it's not just native to our region. In fact, the eastern oyster is native to the entirety of the east coast of North America, all the way from Canada down to Mexico, and is also found in the Gulf of Mexico. So these are pretty wide-ranging oysters and are found all along the east coast. Second, the oyster is what's considered a bivalve mollusk. So let's take a moment to break that down a little bit. Bi meaning two, and valve meaning shells. So it can kind of be hard to see here because these are smaller oysters that are still connected to a larger shell, but each oyster has 2 shells. And this is what one of the shells looks like. So this is the left side valve, and when this oyster was living, there would have been another shell right there connected on the side. And those 2 shells are connected by a very strong ligament at the bottom, and the bottom of an oyster is known as the umbo. So if you've ever tried to shuck an oyster to eat, you know how difficult it can be to break that ligament at the bottom of the shell at the umbo to get it open. And the reason for that is, as you know, oysters have very soft bodies. So these shells are held together by that ligament so that they can protect the soft body of the oyster that's inside. A second interesting fact about the eastern oyster is that this species of oyster forms oyster reefs. So that is very important, and the way that they form oyster reefs you can sort of see here is oyster larvae that float around in the water column are looking for a place to settle. And they're looking for a place to settle and live for the rest of their life. And they seek out and settle on other oyster shells and other living oysters. And the reason that they do that is over generation after generation, they form these large structures that we know as oyster reefs. Not only are these oyster reefs important because they provide the habitat for oysters after generation themselves, but they also provide habitat for hundreds of other species of the Chesapeake Bay. These are fish, crabs, worms, other critters that live on and around an oyster reef. Basically, what these oysters do in constructing this habitat is build a condo for hundreds of other species to come live in. So that's super important to the Chesapeake Bay because without these oyster reefs, those other species that rely on oyster reefs just are not as productive as they could be. Fourth, these are very important water filtration powerhouses. So oysters are what's called a filter feeder. And the reason they're called that is because they take water into their bodies and they filter out of that water algae and other particles that are nutritious for them to eat. And when they're doing that, sometimes they also filter other particles that they can't eat, like little particles of sediment. And those particles they just eject, and they don't eat those, they don't digest them. But what this results in is this filtration capacity results in clearer water and better quality water throughout the Chesapeake Bay. So we used to have a lot more oysters in the Chesapeake Bay than we do now. And it was thought that when we had more oysters in the Chesapeake Bay, all of those oysters could fill the entire volume of the Chesapeake Bay, about 19 trillion gallons of water every 3 days. And now, since we have fewer oysters in the Chesapeake Bay, that same task is expected to take at least a year or more. So individually, every single oyster is a filter powerhouse, but collectively, having large populations of oysters in the Chesapeake Bay can do even more for our water quality. A fifth fun fact about the eastern oyster is that these animals can change their sex. So when these oysters are smaller, they tend to be male, and as they grow older and larger, they tend to transition into females. And what that means is that on a reef where you have mostly small oysters, that'll tend to be all males. On a reef where you tend to have all all large oysters, those will all tend to be females. And that's why having a large diversity in the sizes of oysters on your reef is so important, because with all males and all females, that doesn't really work. What we need is a good mix of small oysters and large oysters, because they tend to transition that sex throughout their lifetime. And lastly, and those of you who follow CBF and know about this issue may already know, but oysters need our help. So the Chesapeake Bay Foundation has been involved for many years in oyster restoration, which is our goal, is to bring back not only the populations of the oysters themselves, but also those oyster reefs and all of the animals that rely on them. And you can help with that. So we have volunteer opportunities. You could become an oyster gardener and grow oysters at your house, which then go on restoration sites. We know that we may not be able to do those activities right now, but as soon as things settle down and we are able to continue our restoration activities this year, we absolutely welcome you all and welcome your help in helping to bring back one of the Chesapeake Bay's most iconic species, the eastern oyster. So if you want more information on our restoration work, on what we're doing, on what we're hoping to do in the future, you can visit our website, which is www.cbf.org. That's all I have for today's blurb on the bay. Thank you so much for joining me. Stay well and be healthy.